Last week on the Corporate Report, we considered the possibility that the recent protests in Iran have been assisted by the US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, all of whom are actively plotting against the Iranian government. As I detailed in that report, the idea only sounds outlandish to those who are ignorant of the history of repeated interventions by foreign powers in the internal politics of Iran. The joint British-American intelligence operation to overthrow Iranian President Mohammad Mossadegh, codenamed Operation TP Ajax and led by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., was a textbook example of how such operations proceed. It is not that the protest movement against Mossadegh was created out of whole cloth. Rather, it was the CIA's job to take a nascent protest movement, a small minority of people within the country already angry at Mossadegh, and then to fund, equip, enlarge, and inflame that movement, greasing the skids to the eventual transfer of power with millions of dollars in cash and promises of further support.
Roosevelt proceeds with a plan that involves rented crowds of people, right?
Right.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, well, this is a big aspect of Iranian politics. Anybody who's been around the last 30 years or so will be familiar with televised scenes of huge crowds in Iran, whether it's when the Ayatollah Khomeini returns to the country after exile or things of that sort. And crowds are a key element going back decades in Iranian politics. Things are just generally unstable enough that if you get enough people out there, you can really change things around. So that was always a key part of the plan. Was there were several aspects to it, but one of the keys was get these crowds out there any way you can and make it look like the Shah has everybody's support, and we hope we'll carry the day.
In fact, from an intelligence point of view, the coup against Mossadegh was a remarkable success beyond all expectations. The operation required only a handful of on-the-ground operatives, $7 million in bribe money for the rent-a-crowds, and the complicity of the bought and controlled corporate media at home. In fact, although the role of the CIA in helping to organize the protests that led to the overthrow of Mossadegh has been known for decades, it wasn't formally admitted by the agency until 2013, 60 years after the fact. Just last year, the State Department released a slew of new documents describing in greater detail how Roosevelt and his agents used rent-a-crowds to boost the support for the Shah and give the impression of a popular uprising. But that was then. This is now. How can an outside power intervene to stir up protests or incite violence in a targeted country in the modern day and age? For an example, we need look no further than the Euromaidan protest in Ukraine in 2014. The Maidan protests, too, involved a mass uprising against a government targeted by the Western powers, and they turned deadly when snipers began firing into the crowds, killing both police and civilians. That both sides were targeted in the shootings makes no sense from a strategic perspective, unless the purpose of the shooting was actually to escalate the violence and drive the protests to their eventual conclusion, the overthrow of President Viktor Yanukovych. Nevertheless, mainstream media in the West immediately blamed the sniper fire on the Ukrainian police. But from the beginning, the evidence contradicted this account. Shortly after the deadly sniper incident, Estonian Foreign Minister Urmas Paet discussed his own findings on the attack with an audibly shocked Catherine Ashton, Foreign Affairs Chief of the European Union.
All the evidence shows that people who were killed by snipers from both sides, among policemen and people from the streets, that they were the same snipers killing people from both sides.
Well, yeah.
So that, and then she also showed me some photos. She said that has medical doctor. She can, say that it is the same handwriting, the same type of bullets, and it's really disturbing that now the new coalition that they don't want to investigate what exactly happened. So that there is now stronger and stronger understanding that behind snipers it was not Yanukovych, but it was somebody from the new coalition.
I think they do want to investigate. I mean, I didn't pick that up. That's interesting. Gosh.
An extensive study of eyewitness reports, ballistic trajectories, radio intercepts, photos and videos of the attacks by Ivan Kachanovsky of the University of Ottawa concluded that the sniper fire was in fact conducted by elements linked to the opposition. But late last year, a Ukrainian courtroom became the stage for the most startling confirmation of this version of events.
3
years ago, mercenary snipers from Georgia fired on protesters on Maidan Square. Today, their guilt has been proven in court in Kiev. The attorney of ex-President Yanukovych revealed the story of the people who got paid for the mass murder. There is footage of the massacre among the evidence. The mercenaries even agreed to testify in court. Their goal was to instigate a conflict between the protesters and law enforcement using firearms. Witness Koba Nagadze was at the Ukraine hotel and saw snipers firing at both protesters as well as law enforcement officers. The plan is as devilish as it is simple. Use indiscriminate murder and violence as a way to escalate a conflict and drive an agenda. In this case, the atrocity on the Maidan Square made negotiations between the protesters and the Yanukovych government impossible. But Maidan Square was by no means the first time that such a strategy had been employed to generate such a crisis. The Syrian government, like the government of President Yanukovych in Ukraine, found itself in the crosshairs of the Pentagon. In a program reminiscent of Operation Ajax, the Bush administration began funneling millions of dollars to opposition groups in Syria in 2006, and, just like in Iran in 1953, these funds eventually paid off in the form of a spontaneous protest movement in the city of Daraa in March 2011. We are told that the Syrian civil war began on March 18, 2011, when Syrian security forces opened fire on peaceful anti-government protesters. Never mentioned in this mainstream narrative, however, is that one of those shot that day was, in fact, a policeman, and that in the ensuing days, several more policemen were killed by rooftop snipers who were firing at protesters and police indiscriminately. Not coincidentally, these events began to unfold just after the appointment of Robert Ford as U.S. Ambassador to Syria. As Professor Michel Chossudovsky of the Center for Research on Globalization explains, Ford, having served time as the number 2 man to John Negroponte at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, was no stranger to the use of death squads and paramilitary troops as a means of generating a political crisis.
If we go back to February or January of 2011, we have, in fact, I think it was end of January, Robert Stephen Ford is appointed U.S. ambassador. I happened to be in Damascus at the time of his appointment. I spent 2 months in Syria in the 2 months preceding the outbreak of the insurrection. But Robert Stephen Ford is a very important figure in an understanding of what happened. Robert Stephen Ford was number 2 man in the U.S. Embassy under John Negroponte. And as we know, John Negroponte, which has a whole personal history of supporting and creating death squads going back to the heyday of Central America. He was based in Honduras. He sponsored the death squads in Honduras and in Nicaragua. So we're going back to another era. But he was brought to Iraq precisely to create those death squads and also to insert the death squads in the Iraqi police. Who was his number 2 man? Robert Stephen Ford. And Robert Stephen Ford, in fact, played a far more crucial role than Negroponte because he actually speaks Arabic and he speaks Turkish, and he was also in contact with the various factions in Iraq. And then Robert Stephen Ford, actually after a stint in Algeria, turns up in Syria. And he has played, he's a very key State Department official. He played a key role in the process of recruitment of these death squads, modeled on what had been applied previously in Iraq, and also modeled on what was called the Salvador option in Central America. So it really is the application of the Salvador option to the Middle East. And if we look at the track record of the rebel forces in Syria, we can see that the same training process applied. These are killers, and they are there to kill civilians. They have a certain pattern of executing people who are Shiite or Alawite, and then they also have procedures for executing what they call the traitors within the Sunni community. And then what was applied was the concept of ethnic cleansing in all the Christian communities in Syria. So there was a very structured insurrection which was essentially directed against the civilian population. And then what happened is that when these atrocities were committed, the Western media casually accused the Syrian government of killing its own people. The accusations were absurd, but at the time people believed them. Subsequently, many reports came through which actually contradicted this interpretation or falsification of the mainstream media. And then they started on to saying, well, there are atrocities on both sides. But the fact of the matter is that these death squads were set loose in a sovereign country with a view to destabilizing civil society. Killing people was the basis for that destabilization. The destruction of buildings and residential complexes and so on was part of it.